Welcome back, everyone. In the last lesson, we learned how to hook into this onCreateNode method inside of our Gatsby Node.js. This method allowed us to hook into the build process when Gatsby would go through our files and build out the individual node representations of them. And then we were specifically looking for nodes of the type of Markdown remark. We then added this new node field on it equal to slug, and the slug pointed to the new file path that we made. So now that we've modified these Markdown nodes, we have the actual slug value that we can access inside of our application. And in this lesson, we actually need to use that because we're going to build out the final pages that our Markdowns represent inside of our website that point to the actual blog posts that we want the users to see. So just like we saw with our pages folder, which had any files that we wanted to represent as the final page that our users could see, we're going to do the same thing with our Markdown files. So one thing that we have to know is that we have to use another method inside of our Gatsby Node.js. I'm going to give you documentation to this API so that you can see any other methods you can access, and you can also look up anything that we've already used before to get a better understanding of it. But the next one we're going to use is called createPages. And createPages gets two arguments that we want to destructure off. The first one is just GraphQL, which is pretty much the same way that we've made GraphQL queries before. We can just now do so inside of our Node.js. And the other thing we get is actions. Now, what we're going to pull off of these actions is the method createPage. CreatePage is an action that allows us to actually build the pages inside of our application based on whatever properties we pass to it that we'll discover once we actually use it. So what we want to actually return from our createPages function right here, though, is we want to return a GraphQL query that gives us back all of our Markdown remarks. Then we're going to iterate over it and simply just call createPage on each of those Markdown nodes. So in order for us to do this, we have to use the GraphQL query that we got back. So to use it, we're just going to say GraphQL, and then we're going to pass it with these parentheses. Now, if you're curious as to why inside of here we have to use these parentheses, whereas inside of our front end React applications, we don't, this is because there's a new template syntax in ES6 that allows you to pass template literal strings like this in the front end, as long as you have access to ES6, which is pretty much equivalent to doing this. There's really no difference. But because with Node.js, we do not get ES6 features right out the jump, we do not have access to writing it this way. So we have to pass these parentheses. Just if you're curious as to why here we have to do it. So that's just one thing you have to remember if you ever use the GraphQL query inside of your Node.js. Now, there are setups that you can do with Node.js and Express so that you do get to use that same syntax as you are familiar with in your front end. But in our case, it's not necessary. It's extra work that really, just to avoid adding these parentheses, is not worth it. But now that we have our GraphQL query, we have to make the actual query for our all Markdown remarks. So we're going to do this inside of our graphical just so we can actually see this. So inside of your playground, what you're going to do is you are going to click all Markdown remark. We want the edges. We want the node from these edges. We want the fields, and off these fields, we want the slug. If we fire off this request, we see that this is going to be the object we get back. We're going to need to pull off this edges array and iterate over this so that we can call createPage using each of these node objects to build the actual page, because this holds the data that we need. So let's just copy over our query object. We'll go back to our code and just paste this in. Now, GraphQL, the method will simply return us a result inside of a promise. So once this resolves, we just call .then on it, and we will get the result value. And off of that result value, it will be that shape that we saw. So we want to look at the data, and off the data, we want our all Markdown remark. And all Markdown remark, we want the edges array. So we just want to loop over this array with for each, And for every element inside, we want to pluck off the node because that's all we need. Now with this node, we are going to call createPage, and we're going to pass createPage an object. And this object is going to define the properties that this createPage needs in order to actually build out the page that we're looking for. So the first thing it needs is the path. The path will tell it in the final application what path actually leads to this page that I'm building. And this is where we're going to use our slug. So we're going to say nodefields.slug. And here we're going to pass the actual component. Now the component is going to be the template that it uses in order to actually populate out the final blog post. So this is pretty much going to be a React component. And here we're going to make the new blog post template that we need to use for this context. So we do want to keep this component that we're going to build separate from our front-end components because it will only be used inside of our Gatsby Node.js file. So we'll make a new folder called templates. And inside of here, we're going to make a new file called blogpost.js. So normally you might be used to every React component that we write being .jsx. And this is totally valid too if you want to make it .jsx. But because every single React component that we have inside of our Gatsby folder is a .js file, for consistency's sake, we'll just use .js. Babel knows that if you have React inside of your JavaScript, it will convert it to regular JavaScript. So it's not a big issue. It'll still work. So here we're just going to say blogpost.js. Now, because this video is getting too long, let's just break this up and continue this inside of our next lesson.